We are absolutely delighted to have the pleasure of introducing the second of our keynote speakers, our second and final keynote speaker of the workshop, Massimo Palma. Massimo is currently a junior researcher of political philosophy at SUAD, Orsola Benincasa University in Naples. He is managing editor of the journal Philosophy and Public Issues, co-founder of the Italian Walter Benjamin Association, and is the editor and translator of the works of Benjamin, Max Weber, and Georges Bataille. He has also published books on Benjamin, Eric Weil, French Hegelianism, the politics of memory, and of course, on Kojève. In addition to a chapter dedicated to Kojève in his 2017 book on Hegelian mythologies entitled Foto di Gruppo Conservatore, he has written an important book, Politica e Diritto in Kojève. It's very useful for my own work, I would have to add. And this book is dedicates itself to exploring in depth the political and juridical thought of Kojève at the intersection of the works of Weber, Carl Schmitt, and Marcel Mauss, amongst others. He is here with us today to present new work on Kojève, I am told, in a talk compellingly entitled The Storytelling of the Father, the Book, the Tradition, the Authority, according to Kojève. So take it away, Massimo.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Let me thank each and every one among the organizers of this inspiring workshop, Isabel, Kyle, Jorge, and Trevor Wilson, for your scientific approach, which is I really appreciate, and your kindness. Let me also suggest that workshop is definitely a good definition for a bunch of people reflecting on this author nowadays. For today, Kojève's legacy is a sort of a building site. And I do think that sometimes heavy, sometimes funny-shaped clouds still stand upon this site. My contribution to the shaping of my Kojève cloud is meant to investigate his role, if there is any today, in the thought of the authority of the father, that is, in simply Greek terms, patriarchy. In my opinion, his thought helps us determining the very concept of patriarchy and tradition as a book. That is, as a long written storytelling that produces unquestioned obedience, or as a tradition that signifies the impossibility of conflict, or again, as the mythology of a never-ending male command that causes no resistance. But Shaw, along the tour, is requested to give some evidence to this hypothesis. The most proper definition of the concept of authority in Kojève happens when World War II is at its peak. It happens when, among several predicaments, once he has fled from occupied Paris, Kojève writes an unusually short text. Its title, as everybody knows, is La notion de l'autorité. This text will remain unpublished until the beginning of our century. Some further relevant reflections on the notion of authority are to be found in the other writing he wrote during the war, but was not published until 1981, Le Skisse d'une union légitime. Actually, Kojève had been considering the topic since the beginning of the 30s, if not before. Although he didn't single out the concept of authority from a formal point of view, he did offer some hints in what we can consider his scientific debut. And we better start from here. The essay, already mentioned many times, is called La métaphysique religieuse de Vladimir Solovyov. And it is a wide reflection on 19th century Russian thinker. An extract of the dissertation he had discussed under the direction of Karl Jaspers in Russian Heidelberg in 1926, Die religiöse Philosophie Vladimir Solovyov. An excerpt of the dissertation had already been published in German in 1930. At the time, Kojève had already moved to Paris. In this new old work on Solovyov, he eventually published in 1934, we can find a first hint of a typology of the very concept of authority we analyzed during the war. A few years ago, quite a few, Bruce Lincoln, in a brief classic essay on the topic, defined authority as the effect of a synthesis that occurs as the soon-to-become authoritative subject seizes the good opportunity. Such a synthesis, so Lincoln, happens when rhetorical ability and operative framework unite. Quoting Lincoln, authority is an effect that depends for its power on the combination of the right speaker, the right speech, the right staging and props, the right time and place. Unlike Lincoln, in his writing on Solovyov, Kojève identifies authority with a cause, yet he still calls it power. He determines its different meanings, approaching a sort of sociology of authoritative forms. He would make it a sort of phenomenology only later. At the end of the essay, Kojève gets to explain how Solovyov's unitotality, that is the concept of the union of the absolute with its other, takes shapes in the world. In that part of his exposition, Kojève makes a type out of three different authorities. Given the social order as harmony of three powers, he identifies the three powers with three different temporal dimensions. I'm quoting from the essay. Each society represents unitotal temporality through the union of three powers: that of the priest, representing and preserving the past; that of the warrior, acting in the present; and that of the prophet, anticipating the future and marking its objective and purpose. Finally, the progress of civilizations gradually frees man from his dependence on nature. Each one of the three powers in Solovyov, the three authorities, has a dimension of fulfillment. The first has a sort of charismatic nature. It is the prophet, associated to the future. The hierocratic theocratic, the priest, preserves the past. The warrior, the only persona that lacks an immediate religious nuance, embodies the present. What matters the most, though, is precisely the temporal dimension of Kojèvian typization, although he still depends on Solovyov. Authority exists in time, and its types are three different ways of development that are capable to cause effects: to preserve and to represent the past, to act in the present, to point at a goal in the future. What matters most for us is a double movement happening with respect to the past: protection, typical for preservation, and shaping, typical for representation. Nevertheless, in the same months Kojève was publishing a small text on Solovyov, he was already commenting Hegel, Phenomenology of the Spirit. While commenting Hegel, the concept of authority of the past wears a paper dress. It becomes a book. The changing of the clothes happens when, in the 9th lecture of the last year of the seminar, 38-39, Kojève uses the very formula he will be identified with in the story of his reception, The End of History. His infamous mythological expression will get Fukuyama celebrating in 1989 as the final destination of Weltgeschichte. This all happens during the seminar. Kojève is dealing with the 8th chapter of Hegel's Phenomenology, Absolute Knowledge. This is precisely where we can find the right place for Kojève's doctrine of the sage. Here, at the end of the phenomenological path, Kojève reworks, not oblivious of Solovyov's teaching, Hegelian infinity and the temporal movement of the concept. In a subjectivity that knows the absolute, true eternity is in time, as long as true infinity is the immanent pulsation of the finite. I'm quoting Jean-François Kerrigan. It is precisely when concept gets to an omniscient thinking that, according to Kojève, the existence of the book can be put into question as the exterior existence of science in the world. This part has not been translated in Nichols' edition. I try to provide my translation. The book has a duration too. It deteriorates, it is reprinted, etc. Nonetheless, the umpteenth edition is nothing different from the first. You cannot change nor add anything to it. Although it changes in its exterior form, the book stays the same. The time where it lasts is natural or cosmic, not historical or human. Future readers do not change anything in the book. And if in order to read the book, the man has to live, that is, to be born, develop, and die, his life, as it is reduced basically to this reading, does not create anything new. History has ended. There is nothing else to do, and you are a man as long as you read and understand the book revealing what has and could have been done. End of quotation. When absolute knowledge comes true, the last book is being written. The one who wrote is Hegel. Of course, it is all about him, indeed. Hegel, writing the Phenomenology of the Spirit, suppresses time. That is the dimension when man is transforming the given through struggle and walk. In Kojève's brutal dualism, the book is a spiritual object. Formally, the book is therefore no merely a natural entity, something comparable to a stone. The book is dead wisdom. As Jack Love puts it, it is no living wisdom, but the exteriorization or objectification of the sage in a material artifact. The book is meaning. The book is a speech where desires and actions dwell no more. It is the atemporal result, the timeless result of the activity of the sage, who as man and citizen integrates the historical evolution of humanity. It is the activity of the sage that brings the book into being. The sage causes the book once his civic and historical activity reaches its fulfillment. As it is known, the Hegelian fulfillment is read by Kojève in a Napoleon key. The juridical spread of the revolutionary ideas in Europe at the beginning of the 19th century would prepare the path for a universalization of Hegelian ideas. This very reading, that Kojève would then reinterpret in a philo-Stalinian way, would provoke an infamous annotation, which is the following. The fact that at the end of time, the word concept detaches from man and empirically exists, not in the shape of human reality, but of a book, this fact reveals man's essential finitude. It is not this or that man that dies. Man himself dies. The end of history is death of man. After such death, there are still 1. Living boys in human form but lacking spirit, it has time or creative power, and 2. Empirically existing spirit in the shape of inorganic, not living reality. A book is something that has no animal life and has therefore nothing to do with time either. The relationship between the sage and his book is strictly analogous to that between man and his death. Once it is released, the book detaches from me. It ceases to be me after my death. Death is as impersonal and eternal, that is inhuman, as inhuman, eternal, and impersonal is fully fulfilled spirit. End of quotation. If the sage authorizes the book to autonomous life, if dying to himself, he delivers his paper lineage to impersonal and eternal life, the double identification between the sage and the man, and between the book and death, needs further clarification. As the book distinguishes itself from its creative source, as it gains autonomy in detaching itself, the book does not reproduce what Hegel means by tradition. According to Hegel, tradition is a river-like, continuous stream of spirit. Kojève's book seems more likely to reproduce what Hegel defined as the father-son relationship in the phenomenology of the spirit. An autonomous stranger reality, eine fremde eigene Wirklichkeit, a separation from origin, eine Trennung von der Ursprung, where the origin itself gets dry. This point leads us to a further equation. The sage producing his book has thinly concealed the very features of the father, so it seems. Hegel's father does not swell up like a river. He runs dry in the being for itself, in the Für-sich-Sein of what came after him, not being able to get it back, ohne es zurückzuerhalten. To insist on this analogy, the father sage generating the book, the very last philosophy book, could be easily identified with Hegel himself, according to Kojève, as he put an end to the phenomenology of the spirit. He was ready to write the encyclopedia. Hegel had no more desire apart from seeing his book as an object. The key missing part to comprehend this whole bunch of analogies could be found in the investigation of the father's authoritative elements Kojève made while the war was on. The notion of authority comes up as a quite abstract investigation, Kojève calls it phenomenological and metaphysical, of authoritative forms, the master, the judge, the leader, and the father indeed. In this classification, paternal authority, since Aristotle's first book of politics, the most classical and natural form of arche, this appears to be inactive. It is concentrated on being, but still it operates effects. Before any typology, the general definition of the authority phenomenon in Kojève's text is that of a human relationship, a social, historical relationship. Kojève authority is all in exercising a command that causes obedience without provoking any sort of reaction. Quoting, in the case of authority, the reaction or opposition never exceeds the sphere of pure possibility. It is never actualized. Its realization destroys authority. The latter is the substance of the phenomenological analysis that opens the essay. The book then continues by investigating the authoritative phenomenon under a metaphysical lens, i.e., under the perspective of its temporal dimensions. Then there is a short and quite useless ontological section. Analyses are followed by deductions, political, moral, psychological, and two appendixes that refer to what was going on in France at the time. It has Vichy's regime, one on the authority of the marshal, the other on national revolution. And Marco Filoni has made quite a few investigations on the background of these sections in the last years. As said, in the records of the unreleased treaties, 4 different typologies of authority appear. Such types are referred to 4 different auctoritates in the history of philosophy: Hegel, Aristotle, Plato, scholastics. The first one is the Hegelian character of the master. This has a relationship with risk, struggle. His temporal dimension is present. The Aristotelian Xenophontian leader, pointing and planning, lives in the future. The judge, stemming from Plato and Herodotus, is neutral, impartial, uninterested. He judges ad aeternum. The father, instead, commands starting from the past. His authoritative determination is general. It is given by a quantitative factor. The father has accumulated more time. He has inherited more than those who came after. His status awards him a potestas clavium on tradition. Unimportant. The authority of the father over the child, variance, the authority arising from a great age gap, the authority of the elderly over the young, the authority of tradition and of those who hold it, the authority of the dead, or will, the authority of the author over his oeuvre. End of quotation. Among all types, that of the father is the only one that has no peculiar personal quality. Its definition is particularly rough. It points at the function, not at what he does. Paternal authority has no peculiar talent in directing, projecting, or technically pointing at the future. Nor does the father tend to the acknowledgement of his superiority in a battle for life, as the master does. Nor he boasts an impartial posture as he delivers verdicts, the judge. His only characteristic is a generic virtue in reproducing himself. The father, after all, is merely a cause. I'm quoting. All men are in principle able to do what it takes to achieve the authority of the father, because all that one has to do is to live long enough, while in the 3 other cases of authority, what is involved is in an action in the narrow sense of the term, personal acts that require some special talent that cannot be found in everyone. In any case, we can easily imagine the emergence of the first father invested with a corresponding authority at an epoch where no other authority yet exists, and it is indeed the father himself who engenders the authority that he enjoys. End of quotation. Both universal and indistinct, thanks to this addition of self-evidence, accumulation of time, the authority of the father is the only type to be thought as really spontaneous and socially spread. An authority without charisma, without special gifts, if not mere biological iteration or persistence, it has resistance to the obstacles of life. The authority of the father is the authority of being, not of action, the authority of the cause, of the author, of the origin, of the source of what it is, the authority of the past, which maintains itself in the present by the sole fact of the ontological inertia of being. The addressees of paternal authority are the members of familial society. If family has the goal to create man from a newborn animal that normally produces itself, it has to create the social topos for this man, the world he will live in and act in. And this very topos, so Kojève in the outline for our phenomenology of right, the scenery of the action of those who obey to the commands of an inert father, he only speaks to command, is the patrimony of this family that stands for what concerns its creation, its consumption, and last but not least, its transmission. Patrimony is the common earth of the family, and familiar property is nothing but the materialization of this earth through work. As the work ends, the destiny of the father is what we can call, in Weberian terms, the patrimonialization of familiar identity, its transmissibility in things and properties. The father, moreover, includes all authoritative forms determined by tradition, by senility. Nevertheless, the familiar feature of tradition detaches the father from immediately political tasks. So, Kojève, the family is nothing but a sui generis human entity and becomes a political entity liable to become citizen only as long as it educates the sons and daughter and as it works at the patrimony. This ties the father to domestic economic household, like in Aristotle, which means handling with what is there as patrimony. Those who obey are an effect, are an appendix thereof. What counts is the time dimension that determines its relationship to vitality. The father, as we know, is linked to the past. It is illuminating in this sense to read what Kojève writes on the authority of God Father in the Scholastics, a divine cause of human effects, a hint for the cosmological proof. If the cause acts on the effect by producing it, the effect cannot react on the cause. Again in Weberian terms, the father's authority is a simply traditional Herrschaft, the irresistible force of the usual, of what has always been like that. That, so Weber, rests on an established belief in sanctity of immemorial traditions and the legitimacy of those exercising authority under them. In Kojève's version, Herrschaft develops as the impossibility for the derived to be reluctant with respect to the created element. Traditional obedience displays as the real or supposed fact of the impossibility of, or more precisely, conscious and voluntary renunciations of, any reaction on the part of the effect against the action of the cause upon it. Hence, the identification of the Father with the Creator, the Author. The notion of God the Father, says Kojève, is evident in the moment God is considered the Creator. An effect cannot disown its cause. If the cause acts on the effect by producing it, the effect cannot react on the cause. If the source of the authority is its specific impossibility to gain reaction, being the effect unable to retract, the authority of the cause is per se an indisputable authority. But the cause, says Kojève, transmits by definition its essence or its power, puissance in French, to the effect. It is therefore natural to accept the principle of heredity in the transmission of the authority of the Father, that is, the cause. End of quotation. Thanks to paternal authority, Kojève easily establishes the transmissive principle as essential to any kind of authority. It is causation in general, without obstacles, what really happens in authoritative relationships. But it is highly interesting inside this paternal dynamics, how its social value also engenders a religious feature. Being so attentive to anthropological and social dynamics, Kojève isolates the unifying function of religious representation. The divinity of traditional elements traces a line of continuity in the social group. When it finds the origin in the Godfather, the group becomes more coherent, more consistent. And Kojève says, God is always a custodian God. He is some sort of cause to the social and political group that recognizes his authority. He's the one who guarantees continuity. That is to say, the unity of the group, and fixes its personality by determining its origin. Hence, the traditional character of the divinity, of the sacred divine. God is always the God of ancestors, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Hence, also the sacred divine character of every tradition, the past that determines the present, is generally reduced, eventually, to a divine origin. Once the continuity of the social group is found in tradition and the function of continuity is qualified as divinity, guaranteeing the union, Kojève investigates the authoritative potential of the paternal cause when the holder dies. The tradition of command, once the one who spoke it died, defends itself and keeps on spreading. That's the authority of the dead. We already saw that. A subspecies variant of the authority of the father is the authority of the dead. That is, an authority of the one that is not there anymore. But that, nevertheless, remains as a thing, as a document, as a will, as a testament. This has something to do with the hypothesis of a final work by the sage, a work producing a book. Testament itself, the will, because of the impossibility of any reaction, shows a sort of divine, sacred character of the dead. Kojève says, The authority of the dead can be explained by the fact that the dead are even more cause than the living. The cause generally disappears after it has produced the effect and does not exist in or as the latter. If we go back to what we have seen in the stage at the end of the introduction to the reading of Hegel, in the traditional authoritative phenomenon, Father's authority, we can find quite the same principle in action. The cause dies in the effect. The author dies in the work he has done. It is necessary to take into account the book effect of death as a cause. The book as a will, as a document testifying death and continuation, is the very last effect of a creation. Kojève says the purest case of the authority of the father, considered as the authority of the cause over the effect, is perhaps the authority that an author, in the broadest sense of the word, has over its work. The book, as both an inorganic and spiritual object, is said to be a vector of authority. In the wake of a famous definition by Hobbes in Leviathan chapter 16, if authority is the right of doing any action, the book can be counted among those things inanimate that cannot be authors. As a thing inanimate, the book appears to be not a subject, but a mere function of traditional continuity with the authority of the dead. In the book, the author preserves himself and spreads. The book is the pure case of a paternal authoritative tradition dying, nevertheless dictating actions to be done. In Kojève's vision, the book is the effect of an author sage that lets the work be in its solidity as a thing and dies to the work, guaranteeing the continuity of domination. In this authoritative form, we can see the inertia of the father. The father, though dead, keeps on causing his creature. The father does no action. In order to confirm his identity with himself, he makes so that the actor, he who obeys, act only through the expression documenting the father's will. The paternal authority confirming identity while dying does so through tradition. But tradition is now a thing, an impersonal rest. One could even say a commodity. On this basis, we can determine the strictly conservative character of paternal authority in Kojève. Its metaphysical ground is the definition of real entity as something that tends to preserve and spread. It is the very juridical, legal feature of the issue of tradition. As usual, its plainest explanation is in the outline of the phenomenology of right. I quote, each real entity tends to keep itself indefinitely in existence in staying as it is. It tends to preserve itself. On the other side, it also tends to spread, to extend itself as much as possible, to absorb the totality of real being. In these two aspects, the tendency to act bumps into an exterior resistance that also tends to spread. The tendency, end of quotation. The tendency to be an act is implicit in any entity. Therefore, it is a theater of conflict with reality. This is why Kojève uses death as the domain where the dialectical synthesis between conservation and spread takes place. Everything changes, dies, in order to preserve and spread, he says, in this correction of Spinoza's Conatus. I quote, French Revolution too had to change after Napoleon, so to be able to stay in France as Third Republic, for example. End of quotation. Both instincts of conservation and spread turn into tradition. This happens when the father turns into a book, a death dictating how to operate. This is how the father cause poses itself not only as an efficient or merely material cause, but also as a final one. This is how identity becomes the telos of the historical action of preserving and spreading. Nevertheless, we could push the thing a little bit further inside Kojève's political proposal. This interlacement between father and tradition announces the overall reciprocal recognition. The universal and homogeneous state, the juridical situation at the end of history, appears to be a reformulation of traditional identity taught by a father sage. The identity of the world at the end of history is set off by the book in its permanence. Therefore, in its essay on authority, also Rousseau's general will gets to be read as a function of the father type. I quote from the notion of authority. The authority of the father will, well expresses the hereditary aspect, the permanent side of the causality of the whole. We can therefore say that the authority of the general will is of the father type. It is the authority of the final cause, that is to say, also that of tradition, of all that contributes to the preservation of identity with itself. Genuine hereditary transmission is limited to the only authority of the father, because hereditary transmission is founded on the theory according to which acts, more precisely virtues, or the possibility of such acts, are transmitted from father to son. Hence, says Kojève, the idea that the son, or generally speaking, a related person, inherits the authority of the father. End of quotation. According to him, this theory is based on a primitive, if not magic, way of thinking. Virtue, that is, the possibility of the act, is conceived as some sort of semi-material substance, the mana, which can be found, more or less completely, in all members of the same family, and is transmitted in the fullest way from father to son, but not daughter. End of quotation. This sort of spreading of traditional authority has a political outcome that deserves a last in-depth analysis. As we just saw, as Kojève starts talking about the crisis of paternal authority nowadays, the political applications of the notions of the notion of authority focus on the ethno-anthropological elements in paternal authority, the mana. Such an element had been famously interpreted by Marcel Mauss in 1923-24 with his essay on the gift. The influence of this essay not only on Kojève's apprentices, such as Bataille and Caillois, but on Kojève himself should never be underestimated. In 1942, mana, we saw, causes the recognition of a potential virtue of doing deeds, the possibility of the act itself, performed by another individual or group, not by the one who commands. The chance of spreading the contents of the command. When he defines the constitutional settings from the perspective of the history of political thought, Kojève determines as necessary the identitary relationship with tradition that the authority of the father causes and spreads. But something happens as the bourgeois holds sway. Kojève's argument about the bourgeois age from 1789 to 1940 starts from Montesquieu's renowned division of powers. Such theory, Kojève says, has dominated political thinking until very recent times and determines the excluding attitude that this theory has towards the father typology. I'm quoting once again. Judicial power corresponds to the authority of the judge. Legislative power is nothing other than the authority of the leader, since it is here a question of initiative, of a project, of decisions taken in preparation for the future. As for executive power, it corresponds to the authority of the master, exercised in the present, being action par excellence, which requires on the part of its representative a total abnegation, a subordination of all, and of life itself to the state, that is to say, to something that is essentially non-biological. In other words, this theory eliminates from political authority, automatically, without any discussion, the fourth constitutive element, the authority of the father. End of quotation. Beheading the father in the exercise of political power is therefore shown by Kojève as the true revolutionary element in the bourgeois edition of the constitutional theory. The authoritative excess of the father that spreads through the limbs of tradition gets to be traumatically deleted. In parallel, Kojève adds, 1848 means, nevertheless, a U-turn of the bourgeoisie with respect to its revolutionary potential, a U-turn that stems from the relationship between bourgeoisie and tradition, according to Kojève and Marx indeed. After the symbolic beheading of paternal authority in 1789, after the commitment to the revolutionary project, in 1848, bourgeoisie felt afraid of a new revolutionary class coming on the stage of history, proletariat. That means the end of any tension towards the future for the bourgeoisie. And if the father function is vacant, permanent conflicts are possible. Kojève states that the logical culmination of constitutional theory of Montesquieu is the theory of permanent revolution of a Trotsky. Too much movement announces disgrace. These are highly equivocal conclusions, sure, by a soi-disant Russian Marxist who said he was an admirer of the little father called Stalin while in conversation with Vichy's highest civil servants. What for? Let's recapitulate. The shame bourgeoisie felt for its own tradition, hence the amputation of paternal authority, has to be deleted through revolution. Revolution is necessarily thought to end up with a Gewaltenteilung, division of powers, but it is founded on the authoritative character of the leader, dictator. It's up to him to show the future. But 1848 means a deletion of the future, an erasement. 2. That is the theoretical ground for the short historiographical note explaining why the end of the revolution and the start of bourgeois domination in 1848 forced the social class to leave the exclusive dimension of the present, a present with neither future nor a past. And quoting, domination of the bourgeoisie is therefore simply the progressive disappearance of political reality as such, that is to say, of the power of the authority of the state. Life is dominated by its animal aspect, by concerns related to food and sexuality. Life is dominated by a merely zoological satisfaction. Animalization, as it is pursued by bourgeoisie, has an impolitical outcome. This is where Kojève's analysis reminds us, already in 1942, of Mr. Carl Schmitt. Kojève says the destruction of the authority of the father is therefore fatal, funeste, to political authority in general. Aside from creating a conflict among powers, the incapacity to incorporate in one among the other three types of the authority of tradition and past will then produce an impolitical or apolitical domination. It is properly here that the peculiar note on tradition arrives. La note sur la tradition. Although it insists on long debated topics, insofar this authority of the father is nothing other than the authority of tradition, this note originally reworks the issue of the book that had so much importance, as we saw in the Hegelian seminar. And it reworks it from an historical perspective, that is that of the after 1848 events. Note on tradition, I'm quoting. Every tradition, strictly speaking, that is to say, one whose value and reality are political, is necessarily oral or spectacular, that is to say, direct. The written is by its nature detached from its material medium, from its author, who fixes it in time. The past that is presented only in writing is not for me my past. I very easily dissociate myself from it. Displayed in a book, my country's past is not markedly different from the past of China, for example. I have a tendency to put all writings on the same level and to discuss theories that are displayed in them as if they were conceived outside time. Therefore, the events of 48, by destroying the political link with the past, had primarily to affect oral tradition. It is this tradition that had to disappear in the era of bourgeois domination. End of quotation. Insisting on the difference between oral and written tradition, Kojève stresses the end of an oral story and a direct narration of paternal authority. This means that personal, interested appropriations of the specific difference between my past and that of the others has ended. As they become document, books, the objects of tradition have all the same value. They are no experience anymore. They have value of use. They have value of exchange. Once more, are they commodities? But that which is most important The end of tradition as the end of storytelling of authority is the moment when bourgeoisie depoliticizes itself completely. Having no more attachments to past or to future, the bourgeoisie has no more friends nor enemies. Neither it works nor fights. The fateful amputation of the father brings to a lack of storytelling, a lack of mythologies, a lack of stories at the end of the conflict. As orphan animals out of the choice, bourgeois people look like they were pasturing outside time, feeding themselves with a written culture without doing something as their own anymore, without feeding social dialectics either. And coming towards the end, later on, Kojève will draw the same picture as he did in the notion of authority. But this time he will abandon his analytical style and he'll provoke readers explicitly. In a relative later essay, paternal authority will take the shape of patriarchy thinking with all its traditional notes, causing bewilderment in a fading virility. And this happens in 1956, 2 months after the Hungarian revolt that would rapidly crack the unitary idea of a socialist second world. Kojève, in 1956, publishes on critique an essay called Le Dernier Monde Nouveau. The journal had been founded 10 years before by his friends and disciples, Georges Bataille and Eric Weil. And it was 10 years at the time that Kojève had been a philosopher just in the free time. His job as a prominent civil servant was demanding his full employment. On the weekends, he could get lost in long meditations on the history of philosophy. But his writings on these issues remained unpublished until the year of his death. Sometimes he could write some writings of circumstance, and the last brave new word, Le Dernier Mot Nouveau, was one of them. It was a philosophical reading, as you know, of some recent novels by François Sagan, Bonjour Tristesse, 1954, et Un certain sourire, 1956. Kojève states relevant things on the female characters in these texts. According to him, they would represent a total break both with patriarchal tradition and with the traditional erotic imaginary of the other sex. They represent a prelude to the life at the end of history. That very end of history that had had such an important part in his groundbreaking reading of Hegel during the 30s gets here to be subtly and surprisingly reinterpreted. In Sagan's novels, Kojève says that men disappear. Men, in the sense of Marot, Monteland, Hemingway, that is, male human beings. It is a new world because it is completely and definitely man-free, he says. Nonetheless, the women Sagan describes are no way similar to Amazons. They could not be linked back to a bequeathed role in a world where the height of male power is located, so Kojève, in the Pacific industrious, though properly motorized activity of a fertile bloom. At the end of this bizarre and some way irritating review, Kojève reminds the reader that this world would be, he says twice, in a witty and opaque way, humiliating for us, since all in all, we are men. Humiliating because the specific note of the brave new world is that it virtually won't have no more real wars, no revolutions. Here Kojève repeats the formulas that he had pronounced 20 years before at his Hegelian seminar in front of a tiny noble public. If this is the outcome of the analysis of imagery in Sagan's short novels, its beginning is even better. It is most striking that in a brilliant review such as this is, that tends to confirm in a tongue-in-cheek style the coming of a devirilized world, no wars, no class struggles, no man, the beginning tends immediately to reveal who is the father of such a brave new world. Of course, says Kojève, a single mother gave birth to it, the mother of a purely literary baby. The quest for the father is simple if one accepts Kojève's main thesis. The father is Hegel, but he is the putative father, the one who gave Napoleon, the great cause, the last conqueror, the honor and pleasure to conceive our brave new world. As anybody can see, Kojève's alluding, provoking terms cannot conceal the tendency to find a literary career, a book by a female author, Hegel's idea. This happens in an essay whose goal is to verify the end of the cult of virility in a traditional sense. It is up to the father of this brave new world, father being Napoleon, to consume the last honor and pleasure, to reproduce itself ad libitum, even if in a literary form, in a woman's shape. All along his review, Kojève explains that this woman is not suitable for a traditional role while building a love relationship. Nevertheless, Kojève is playing the fool, as usual, or better, the double agent. He reinserts fragments of authority, even if there is no need for that in a new word. This is shown by the lexical lapse about the father of the newborn book. Honor and satisfaction, as anybody knows, are the keywords of his reading of Hegel. Then, 1942, they are both involved in the explanations of each and every authoritative relationship. Now, in 1956, they refer to the adoption, though paradoxical and metaphoric, of a paternal role. In repeating tradition, once again, though in an eccentric way, Napoleon, the last head of state, the leader who fought for a real goal, the last judge, the author of the Code Civil, he then spread in the conquered territories, here is represented also as the last father, the father of a literary babe. He is the last authority, whose end we cannot see. He will propagate the identity of a male human being posing itself as final cause. He will preserve it in a book object, however strange it may seem. If this is the outcome of Kojève's subtle, ambiguous identifications, among man-shaped animals, there would be nothing new under the sun of tradition and of those entitled to tell about it. This is it. Thank you so much. Sorry for my English.
Thank you very much, Massimo, for an excellent talk. A great deal to discuss, certainly. So I'm sure that many people have questions. I mean, we'll wait for them to come in here. As we wait for that, I suppose that I can start us off with a quick question. I mean, I have many questions, I think, for this text, and I think that perhaps because I'm familiar with the authority text, and I've never thought of linking it in the way that you actually. I've been reading it recently again, and the part in the authority book where he links the authority of the author to the authority of the past, and linking this in the same category to death. When I was reading it, I was drawn to this, and I was trying to think like how to think about the status of the author within such a classification. And here you make a reference here at the end, and perhaps I didn't catch all of it, but a reference to the idea of the commodity, and whether or not the book somehow, in becoming reified, becoming an object, somehow becomes existing within a commodity space. And I guess I don't have an exact question of this, but I was wondering if you can perhaps just expand upon that idea a little bit, because I found that to be intriguing. You're muted, Massimo.
Yeah, not anymore. Well, yeah, it was just a hint. I mean, it was just there was a question mark after commodities. But what I wanted to suggest is that we should also investigate the problem of Kojève speaking speaking about us when he mentions the book. The books in written books are also commodities, and also they are, when he says that they have the same value of exchange, that I cannot get them, I cannot hold them as my tradition. No, the history of Italy is the same as the history of China, and so on. He may also, he's not also, only referring to the fact that written tradition is has lost something of that continuity of experience Walter Benjamin talks about in his famous storyteller essay in 1936. He's also talking, maybe that's my suggestion, or maybe we should also read that in it, about the market, which is our end of history, in a way, which is a place where history has not ended at all, as we know, when conflicts still go on in spectacular ways, or in hidden ways. But we cannot forget that these are also commodities, and that their value is not more neo-Kantian, but their value is something that Marx talked about in the Capital. And so they have a value of exchange, and we cannot, the sage at the end of history, the one who produces the last book, thinks about history not anymore about peak points, points of height, but sees everything as equal. And this equality, this general equality, is something that should be investigated. What does that really mean? And since we have many problems in defining end of history seriously, one of the possibilities is also that, but it cannot be referred to without a question mark. It's just a hint. And we should also reflect that public opinion is made by the public sphere, the written sphere in which we all dwell, is also a commodity. Nowadays, everything is commodity in the written sphere.
No, in fact, it's terrifying to think of perhaps wisdom in the form of a book as a commodity. But
yeah, well, I think we should get easily terrified. It's fine, but since we are, yeah, we are already speaking now, but we are paying services to write to discuss about written books, and yeah, let's think about that.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a bunch of hands raised now. The first in the order is Trevor. So Trevor.
Yeah. Okay. I don't want to make this into a comment instead of a question, which is one of the most insufferable things that one can do at a conference. So excuse me if this comes off like that at the beginning. So thank you, Massimo. That was a very interesting lecture that you just gave, and it made me think about Kojève and Hegel in a way that I don't think, admittedly, I had done so before, this notion of paternity. So precisely in that regard, I kind of want to ask a question that might seem a bit far afield. I'm wondering, in your interpretation of this notion of authority and the father figure, what role you envision someone like Antigone to play? The fact that your discussion of authority and tradition was so gendered, and I'm not saying that's necessarily your fault, that seems to be part of the discourse. You said things like the son inherits the authority of the father, but not the daughter. The book is the authority of the dying, but nevertheless action to be done. And so things like that really made me think of what a central role someone like Antigone plays for Hegel as a woman who is torn between the sort of obligations she has to her family, to tradition, to burying someone, the idea of the dead authority vis-a-vis the state. So I understand that that's a very, very specific question, but it was something that I kept thinking of hearing you speak, because it seems to me that it is something internal to what you're discussing about authority. And there have been lots of interesting feminist philosophers who have taken up Hegel's Antigone, the most obvious Judith Butler, but I'm just curious to hear what you think of that in your own perspective of what you find to be Kojève's authority.
Thank you, Trevor. You are perfectly right, and it's demonstrated by the fact that the very short quotes I got from Hegel are from the ethical spirit, and they are at the end of the discussion of Antigone. So the Fürstig sign, the being by itself of the son and daughter are discussed by Hegel at the end of his elaboration of Sophocles, and there is this problem we should stress together with feminist thinkers who interpreted Hegel in a patriarchal tradition. I was not referring particularly to any of these readings, although I've read Antigone's claim and found it properly interesting by Judith Butler. But when I was saying that the transmission is father-son and not the daughter, I'm mentioning Kojève. I was quoting Kojève, not it was not me. So it's quite interesting that you can find this sort of tongue-in-cheek expressions by Kojève, which also refer to some biographical features I'm not talking about, but this in this review of François Sagan, and also in the 50s in his correspondence with Bataille, there's also this playful speech about male roles and so on. And this is something that we should investigate in a way. Investigating from a philosophical point of view means to come to terms with Hegel's Antigone, with Hegel's reflection on tradition, because in that way Hegel's talk about the legacy that cannot be transmitted in the ethical spirit, in the phenomenology of the spirit. That place is where the independency of sons and daughters begins, and this is not what Kojève was thinking about. Kojève never thinks about that, apart from the fact that the only independence is in the book as the author is dead, but the book receives, it seems like the book receives commands even when the author is dead. That's what he actually says. So Kojève seems to contemplate a tradition which is that one of the philosophy of history in Hegel, not the one of the phenomenology of the spirit. And this tradition has a male character, has a strong virile character, but he seems to be conscious about that. And his reading of François Sagan is something that we must question out of the irony. What does the fact that he mentions Napoleon to be the real father of François Sagan, which is Kojève at its best, but is that merely ironic? I don't think so. I don't think so.
Thank you.
Up next, I think we have a question from Danilo, if I'm going in order.
Thank you, Massimo. I really like the connection that you established between the two texts, La Notion de l'Autorité and this review, Le Dernier Monde Nouveau, because I find it also very hard to gauge that irony, because I think if I remember back a couple of years ago, Laurent Bibar, before that, Shania B. Drury in a book on Kojève, they seem to read that as if Kojève kind of deplores the demise of these traditional gender roles. But there's also, I think, and you kind of hinted at that, the possibility that there's been faintly ridiculous about certain constructions of masculinity. And I think his comments about Hemingway is also that, like, was that ever really to be taken seriously? Yeah, and I mean, and it's very, very open. I mean, that's, for me, that was always an open question. I wouldn't go down that road, but you could ask how, on what end of the spectrum Kojève would come down in these debates about third wave feminisms or identity politics. I think that is something you've been grappling with in your talk. The second point is more that I was a little surprised that you stripped the text of the La Notion de l'Autorité of its sort of contemporary valences at the time. Because I would agree with Nina that obviously it's indubitable, it's beyond doubt that Kojève participated in the resistance. But also, I mean, there's something really troubling about the text, and especially the way he has the authority of the father revolves around Pétain, or the way Pétain embodies it. And the way, I mean, there's a lot of literature about like when France obviously loses the war in 1940, there's massive anxiety about masculinity. And then Vichy officials, I can send you also the book about Vichy officials try to beef up masculinity by re-emphasizing the role of the father, because that military version of masculinity didn't work out because they lost against the Germans. And everything Kojève says, say, about 1848 and so bourgeois revolutions, it's fairly conventional at the time, which you would have heard from Vichyite sources about how bad the Third Republic was. Yeah, that's he at least mimics. I don't say he sort of that's his own view, but he at least mimics a sort of anti-republican discourse. And there's something very odd about that. And third comment is like at the same time, his friend Gaston Fézard publishes his book Autorité et bien commun that has been published at the time. And there he emphasizes the authority of the father, but not in a conservative way, but as something like, because we believe in the authority of the father, of God, divine authority, we must enter the resistance against Pétain. So divine authority legitimizes resistance. Kojève emphasizes the authority of the father, but then sort of builds it around Pétain. It's a very odd constellation, and I'm still struggling with that a little bit. And so, what do you think about how that fits? Because it hasn't been written just at any time, but in May 1942, I think.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I think we cannot give at the moment, at the current state of the art of archival research and so on, we cannot give a definite answer to the real purpose of Kojève in writing that essay, that note sur l'autorité and so on. We know that Henri Moisset, we know thanks to Marco's research, that Henri Moisset was the one who had to read it and to, in a way, to implement it. But this is not, I mean, this is not enough. There are many political judgments in the text. There are the two appendices. Then there's the philosophical part, which is obviously stemming from the Hegel seminar, but there's also much more to that. And I mean, we didn't know that Kojève was a Xenophon reader, and that he could stem his analysis of phenomenological analysis of the leader from the Anabasis, Xenophon's Anabasis. And when we start the treatise, we find it okay. It's a repetition of his seminar, but then it gets really in a wider direction. And I think that the most complicated thing to understand, apart from the immediate political purpose he had in writing that for that person and for that regime, is the connection between the notion of authority and the outline of the phenomenology of right the year later. Because the outline is, I mean, that's the most serious book Kojève has written in a certain way. Okay, much more than the history of philosophy of the 50s, much more. And what's the goal in it? We only know that he wrote it in the lot. We only know about that. We learn that he has read or he has handbooks of German civil and French public and civil law, something that we didn't know. We understand that he's ready to become an administrative civil servant. That's right. I mean, I always find that striking. Because okay, they go to the Mendelssohn, no? To Anne-Catherine Mendelssohn. We only know that, what happened with resistance? What happened with Kojève going to be shot by the Crimeans and by German officers? That's 1942. What about 1943? Why a man like Kojève sits at the table and writes 600 pages on right, and they are so serious, they are so boring also, because he repeats himself so many times. That's the question, and that's a black hole inside his production. I think obviously that another side of it is that's the thing I always insisted on is Carl Schmitt, because he's involved in all this, and I've always tried to retro-date his connaissance, his knowledge of Carl Schmitt, even to the introduction of the reading of Hegel, because otherwise the notion of authority would be deprived of any reference to something that is pretty clearly Carl Schmitt translated for someone who didn't know it. Okay, I don't know if I completely agree with you.
Thanks. I'm actually in a to a shocking extent in complete agreement with you, and I'm glad, I'm relieved someone shares a sense of confusion about the 1940s writings, and even including trying to retrodate the sort of Schmitt acquaintance, which is, I think he must have been aware of him earlier as well, but that would lead us down another avenue. But thank you. Yes, that was really helpful.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely, and we could definitely continue along that line if we, at the end, if we get through these other questions. We have Cristiano has his hand raised. He has a question.
Okay, thank you so much, Massimo, for your talk. I'm going to make a quite selfish question because, as you know, the issue of tradition is a key concept also for my reading of Kojève related to acceleration. And my question is, according to your reading of Kojève, are we legitimized to maintain that by impoverishing as much as possible the notion of tradition in a way, could it be reduced to a merely formal element, namely that of continuity, and maybe a continuity of meanings? So could we say that the very essence of tradition in the final analysis is that of providing continuity from one generation to another, and therefore that all its particular instances, that of the father, the patrimony, the divine, the book, are indeed particular contents of a same form that is tradition / continuity, and that it would be precisely the end of tradition for any reason that may cause the end of man as such, the surviving of man as a living body, but in the absence of any historical spirit.
Thank you, Cristiano. This is a wonderful question, wonderful problem. What I can say is that I've tried to put into a solid relationship Kojève and Weber, Weber's characterization of traditionelle Herrschaft, traditional domination, where continuity is a well-grounded element, resting on the belief that the tradition of what has always been is sort of sacred. Okay, but we have to stress, I think, that Kojève, in this section of the notion of authority, reflects and underlines the fact that tradition is political, that it's very important to understand who holds the keys of the tradition. The tradition has a political role, and so we could say we could put it into contemporary terms and say, who is the storyteller? That's the most important thing to clarify today. Who says things about what we are, what we have always been? So that is the one who dominates. That is the master. So Kojève seems to understand that there's that tradition must be read in a double way. It's double fold. Okay, tradition is not only the conatus preserving itself, but is also like like it was said before in the first panel, it's also spreading, okay, and finding resistance into other beings. So it's quite tradition is a place of conflict. So I mean, it cannot be the end of history tradition if it is political. The problem is, and that's always question marks upon question marks. The problem is that Kojève says that we are in a moment after 1848 where tradition is only written, and that means that tradition becomes apolitical, impolitical, politicless. And okay, that's very Schmittian. That's very, but I don't know if but he certainly knows the conference, 1929 conference about the Entpolitisierung and Neutralisierung. I think he knows it already in 1942, but he seems to be talking about an idea of tradition nowadays where people pasture the Schmidt's Biden, okay, which he discusses in 1955 correspondence with Schmidt. So it's all about sort of an impolitical tradition means end of history. But what does that mean? So
this would mean that
Cristiano, I think we're going to have to move on to the next questions here because we got a lot of questions here. I'm sorry to have to interrupt this, but perhaps you guys can take it on offline. Sorry about that.
Okay.
We have a few more. We have a few more hands raised, but we also had some questions that came into the chat earlier, and it was a double question. It was one from George, and that was followed up by Teresa. And the question for George was that he was surprised by your analysis of that put a lot of emphasis on the concept on the idea of the past, and he was wondering if Kojève wasn't so much disappointed with the disappearance of authority of the past, but actually accepted it. And if this is the case, then does this change the status of the book, the Father, and the other notions associated with the past tradition? And perhaps these would assume a different role if the emphasis was taken off the past. And then adding to this, Teresa agrees that Kojève makes a strong critique of modernity in this way, and then in this sense links with the Schmittian notion of depoliticization, but agrees with George that Kojève's critique of modernity is perhaps not so regressive, but is in fact progressive. And so she has a similar question that George has.
Well, I don't know if I couldn't find I couldn't read it with the UN, so I was looking for the chat, but I didn't read it. I only heard. So I may make confusion. I apologize in advance. What? Yeah, let's say it very, very simply, very plainly. The main problem is Kojève's ideology. Okay, in a way, if we believe it, it has a conservative potential or a progressive potential, and that's what I wanted to, in a way, to put into the into the discussion today, also from this quite eccentric point of view of the paternal authority. I quite, as you may have understood, I think that in his exoteric, we have to say that, exoteric writings, because they were unpublished, we find both elements. Okay, where in the l'esquisse du phénoménologie du droit is something that ends in that way. Teresa so brilliantly talked about on Wednesday. It has a Kantian reminiscence in a way. The definition of the homogeneous state is something progressive, okay, progressive, something that tends to an end of conflict from a point of view we could even adopt today, okay, and that's why I don't understand. Is it the same man who writes the notion of authority? that's pretty difficult, and that's why the biographical intellectual reconstructions are so important, because we understand so not only sources but also directions of a man whose public writing is so restricted. And if we read the public writing in the 50s, we only find jokes about Hemingway, about Sagan. We find the very important art of writing dedicated to Leo Strauss about the Emperor Julian, which is so important because it's a sort of autobiography also, but it's referred to Strauss, so it's very problematic. But we have a secret Kojève who wanted to stay secret, because actually we read it 60 years later or 40 years later than written. So I don't have a definite answer at the moment, but I just want to stress that his correspondents were Carl Schmitt, Leo Strauss, and very interestingly also Georges Bataille. And we have to understand why these three people stay together with him. Why, for example, he said Eric Weil was so boring for him, which had a role in Kojève's life, so important in Kojève's life, even during the 30s. That's the question we have to put it from a point of view of intellectual biography. So.
Thank you very much. Yeah, no, thank you very much, Massimo. This conflict between the notion of authority and the outline it's very perplexing. I think that it's also a discussion we can talk about for a long time, as Danilo was already suggesting. Up next, we have Marco Falloni, I believe.
Yes, I follow up the question of Danilo, and so, you know, Massimo, I agree with you. We have been discussed this subject for at least 10 years, and I agree with you, with Danilo, in the Kojève writings of 40s. He split between the Vichy government and the resistance. And so, you know, Massimo, Kojève decided to do something for the resistance. He chose the action in the resistance. And at the same time, he chose to be theoretic in the Vichy government. And I asked myself, and I want to ask to you, why? So, why he chose for the government of Vichy, he chose to use his theoretical part of action, and for the resistance, he chose to use the action. So, you know, in my book, you know, because you read, I wrote a lot of pages. Nina said to us yesterday about Joseph Bass, Monsieur André, who is one of the most important protagonists of the Jewish resistance in the south part of France. And it's very, very important to say. So at the same time that Kojève wrote, the real authority is the authority of Pétain, he chose to be active in the Jewish resistance in Marseille. So what do you think about this split between a theory and action?
Well, that's probably a question. It's your turn to answer. It's a question for you. I mean, it's that's one of the problems that Kojève's legacy to us represents. I mean, we only now we have more elements, but if we know, I mean, in the 40s, Kojève was only known for the fact that he had published some reviews, some discussions of boring phenomenological books in the Recherche Philosophique, and for that incredible introduction to his own reading that was in Mesure in 1939. Then the war. I mean, Kojève was nothing from a public point of view. He becomes a civil servant in at the end of 1949. So it's quite, I mean, it's quite questionable what do the other knew about him during the war years. I mean, in Joseph Pass, Monsieur André was a prominent person in French resistance, and the fact that the Kojève and Nina Ivanov were connected to all that happened in Marseille from the resistance point of view, that's quite impressive from the historical point of view. At the same time, it's obvious that the man who was risking his life for resistance was writing the notion of authority, mentioning notice sur le travail and other things we don't know exactly how to locate in his oeuvre. For Henri Moisset, who was an important person and who was even defended by Eric Weil at the end of the war, and so on. So, and we also know Raymond Queneau was another huge character who had some connections with the Vichy regime and with intellectual. I mean, in the intellectual group Kojève was in, was used to ambiguity. But Kojève was the most ambiguous of all, just like Kojève. I mean, well, Kojève during the First World War. No, so we have to come to terms with that and to understand, in the notion of authority, what things were written for a certain purpose, a political purpose, what things were written from I mean, a philosophical political purpose, a philosophy of law purpose. And that's hard to understand. It's hard to understand, to discern, to discriminate what's intended to be written for today and what is for eternity, since it's something that maybe Henri Moisset read and the other things we don't understand. So it's that's an open question, and we have to study. You have to study for us.
Thank you very much, Massimo. We still have a few questions left, but actually, unfortunately, we're running out of time, and I'm going to have to apologize to Luis. I think because we have another session coming up in 5 minutes, and I think that taking a break would be an idea before this. So perhaps you can take that question offline or in an email form, Luis. There's also some questions in the chat that there's a lot of dialogue happening there. But anyways, let's all give a round of applause for Massimo for an excellent talk. And thank you very much, Massimo. Excellent discussion as well.
Thank you so much.